Now, two concepts we're going to talk about in this video is subleasing, or sometimes called subletting, and assignment of leases. Now, a couple of things before we get going. Remember, all real estate contracts can be assigned unless the contract strictly prohibits it. So absent some kind of prohibition, every real estate contract, including a lease contract, can be assigned. So I'm going to explain the differences between assignment of a lease and subleasing. So check this out. So in a typical landlord-tenant relationship, we have two parties. We have the lessor, and the lessor is the landlord. And there's a lease agreement that's entered into with the lessee, Leasse. That is the tenant. All right, so let's say it's a 1-year lease and it's $500 a month, and this is a single family house. Now, it doesn't matter what type of contract it is or what type of property. It can be a single family home, an apartment, a commercial space. It doesn't matter. Conceptually, it's all the same. So this is a 1-year lease. Two months into that 1-year lease, the tenant decides they want to move. And they found a friend of theirs that wants to take the lease over. So what's going to happen is the tenant is going to do one of two things. If the lease agreement strictly prohibits it, the tenant may go to the landlord and get written permission to do it. Or in the case where the lease agreement doesn't have any kind of prohibition, then the tenant is free to do it. Now remember, the relationship here are the legal terms in this relationship between the landlord and tenant. The landlord is the lessor with an OR, and the tenant is the lessee. All right. Now at the point that the tenant wants to assign the lease agreement over to somebody else, the relationships change and so do the legal names. All right. So the tenant wants to assign the lease agreement over to one of their friends. So the tenant becomes what's called the assignor. Assignor. And the person that's receiving the assigned lease agreement is the, you guessed it, assignee with two E's. All right? So the relationship between these two is called the assignor, the assignee, but this relationship between the landlord and tenant still exists, which becomes the lessor, or which is the lessor and lessee, right? That's why I drew this the way it is. Now, here's the deal. The original term of this lease agreement was 1 year for $500 a month, so on and so forth. So let's say that it's Tom that is receiving the assignment. So the tenant is going to assign the lease over to Tom. Tom still must abide by all the terms of the original lease agreement. So it's still going to be for the remaining the balance of the 1 year. It's going to be $500 a month and all the other rules and regs. In fact, Tom is more than likely going to pay monthly rent to the landlord. It can go through the tenant, but typically it doesn't. It kind of depends on how the assignment is set up. So you have to know for the real estate licensing exam who the parties are. Landlord, tenant, or lessor, lessee, but at the time that the assignment happens, then the tenant is legally known as the assignor and Tom is the assignee. Now let's talk about the same scenario, but we're doing subleasing here. Now it's a different beast. All right, so we have the landlord, which is the lessor, and they have a contract, a lease agreement with the lessee with two E's. Now what happens, instead of the tenant assigning the contract, the tenant becomes the landlord. So what happens is the tenant becomes what's called the sublessor. O-R, lessor, because they are a subtenant or a sublandlord. And they turn around and rent the property out to what's called a subtenant or a sublessee. All right? So here's how this works. The landlord rents the property out. It's a 1-year lease agreement at $500 per month. But the tenant says, hey, I think this property's under rented. I think I can make a couple of $100 extra a month. So the tenant finds a tenant and then says, hey, I'll move out, you can move in. But guess what? The rent is $700 a month. So the subtenant is going to pay the original tenant $700 a month, and then the original tenant's going to pay the landlord $500 a month. So the tenant's going to make $200 a month extra. That's how that one works. Now here's the interesting thing, that if the subtenant stops paying the rent, just like in our assignment, the tenant, the original tenant, is still responsible for all the terms and conditions of that original lease agreement. Even though they have a separate lease agreement here, they're still bound by it. So if this particular tenant stops paying the rent and an eviction has to happen, the landlord actually has to evict both of them. It can be very complicated legally. Now up here, Tom, as I said, has to abide by the original terms of the contract, and the same would exist that if somebody stops paying the rent here, then the landlord's going to evict both of them. The thing to remember is the process, how it all works, and you have to understand who is who. Who is who here as far as their legal names go.